Everyone to our webinar. My name is Dr. Stephen Wong, and I will be your moderator today for this webinar. I am a research and development engineer at the UC Institute of Transportation Studies, the California Resilient and Innovative Mobility Initiative, also known as CA-RIMI, and the UC Berkeley Transportation Sustainability Research Center. On behalf of the UCITS and CA-RIMI, we welcome you to this important webinar on the effect of COVID-19 on long-term travel behavior. We'll be hearing from three UCITS researchers, Dr. Rizwana Rafiq from UC Irvine, Professor Michael McNally from UC Irvine, and Dr. Giovanni Turcella from UC Davis. The COVID-19 pandemic will affect long-term travel behavior patterns over the coming decades. The researchers will share new research from the UCITS on current and future shifts in travel behavior and attitudes, including a focus on the impact of COVID-19 on telecommuting as a result of changing work policies. Briefly about UCITS. The University of California Institute of Transportation Studies is an expansive network of faculty, research, and administrative staff and students dedicated to advancing the state-of-the-art in transportation engineering, planning, and policy to benefit the residents of California, the nation, and the world. Established by the California legislature in 1947, the UCITS has branches at UC Berkeley, UC Davis, UC Irvine, and UCLA. The UCITS statewide transportation research program is supported by the state of California through funding from the Road Repair and Accountability Act of 2017, also known as Senate Bill 1, and the Public Transportation Account. One of the unique and most recent initiatives funded by SB 1 is CA-RIMI, an initiative of UCITS. The California Resilient and Innovative Mobility Initiative serves as a living laboratory, bringing together university experts, policymakers, public agencies, industry stakeholders, and community leaders to inform the transportation system's immediate COVID-19 response and recovery needs, while establishing long-term sustainable and resilient transportation in California and the United States. So just a few housekeeping items before we start today. If you run into technical issues, let us know by typing a message in the chat box. If you have questions for the speakers, then click on the Q&A icon. A screen will pop up where you can enter your question. Speakers will type responses to questions throughout the webinar, and some questions will be responded to live after presentations. All right, with that, I want to introduce two researchers from UC Irvine. First, Dr. Rizwana Rafiq is an assistant project scientist in the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Irvine, where she received her PhD in transportation science. Her research interests broadly lie in the areas of activity-based travel behavior, transportation equity, transportation data science, and sustainable transportation and shared mobility services. Second, Dr. Michael McNally is a professor of civil and environmental engineering and a faculty associate of the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Irvine. His research interests focus on the study of complex travel behavior, investigations of interrelationships between transportation and land use, and the development of technologies and modeling methodologies which reflect and support these research areas. Welcome, Dr. Rafiq and Professor McNally.
Thank you, Stephen. So can I share my presentation?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay.
Looks good.
Yeah. Let me hide it. Okay. Okay, thank you, Stephen. Good afternoon, everyone. Today, I will talk about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on telecommuting practice and travel behavior in the US with a particular focus on California. I'm Rizwana Rafiq. My co-authors are Professor McNally from University of California, Irvine, and Dr. Yusuf Sarwar from University of Missouri, Kansas City. Sorry, my presentation stuck. Sorry, it's stuck here. I don't know why. Sorry.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm fine. Sorry. Yeah. So, as you all know, due to the current outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic and its subsequent activity travel restrictions, work from home has become an inevitable response, and it has seen significant growth since 2020. According to a research by National Bureau of Economic Research, during February to May 2020, over one-third of the US labor force substituted in-person work with work from home, and the fraction of people working from home during COVID was 6 times higher than the pre-COVID period. In relation to COVID, telecommuting, and travel, we have addressed 3 broad questions. First, so I will talk about those questions and the associated findings. The first question was, what was the impact of COVID on telecommuting? We observed that work from home increased 5-fold in California during pandemic, and 39% California households replaced in-person work with work from home. Our second question was, what did activity travel change due to COVID? We found that work visits as well as retail and recreation decreased substantially compared to the other activity visits. California had a higher reduction of total trips than comparable states. And the change pattern in long distance trip was kind of unique compared to the other trip lengths. Here, long distance trips are defined as the trips that are 50 miles or above. The last question that we addressed, what is the relationship between telecommuting and activity travel during COVID? We found that increased work from home significantly reduces work trips, and a reduction in work trips causes a reduction in non-work trips, mostly those non-work trips that are associated with the work trips. And work from home decreased person mile travel. And finally, the impact of telecommuting is likely greatest in reducing peak period VMT and associated impacts. I want to mention here that these results under the first 2 questions are based on averages aggregated over the first 12 months of the pandemic prior to the major vaccination effort of 2021. And for the last one, the results are applicable only to the initial 2 months of the outbreak period. So here is our study time frame. This graph is showing the COVID spread in the US. And as I mentioned, our first 2 questions, we focus on the 1-year period from March 22 to March 2021. And for the last one, we have selected a 8-week span of the spring outbreak period. Our primary focus of this study is on California, and in some cases, we compared California with other urban states, for example, New York, Texas, and Florida, and also 4 other rural states, New Mexico, Vermont, Wyoming, and North Dakota. We have selected these urban state and rural state based on their predominant geographies, population density, and fraction of people living in urban areas. These 2 graphs are showing the infection rate in these 8 selected states. The left one is showing the urban state, whereas the right one is showing the rural states. And we can see differences in spread between urban and rural states. In urban state, we can see the multiple waves throughout the year, whereas in the rural state, we can see a single wave, particularly in the fall period. As you can see, we have used varieties of data sources, and most of the data sources are provided at aggregate level. So our analysis will be presented at aggregate level, mostly at county or state level. We will not show any results at the individual or person level. So I want to first start our first question, how telecommuting changed during COVID. But before starting that, I want to take your attention towards a very brief analysis of the work from home before COVID. We observed that 5.7% did work from home before COVID, and we were interested to see what are the primary characteristics of those people who worked from home or who had option to do so. And it turns out that higher income people belongs to smaller household size consist of 1 to 2 persons, higher educational qualification, and who are in professional, managerial, and technical occupations could do more work from home or had more options to do so. The opportunities of adopting telecommuting during COVID depends on the availability of resources or facilities in a state or county. We wanted to see the prevalence of such opportunities in California compared to the nation in general. And we observed that most of the opportunities, for example, median household income, fraction of workers in telecommutable job, fraction of households with computing device or internet access, everything was higher in California than the whole nation. And interestingly, although the fraction of households having internet access and commuting device was lower in rural counties compared to the urban counties, but still the fraction is higher than the nation in general. So now come to the point, how much telecommuting changed during COVID? And as I mentioned before, pandemic, the work from home fraction was 5.7% in California. And during COVID, the fraction of people who worked from home turned out to 34.6%. And this fraction is calculated over the 1 year period average. And so we can say that work from home increased by a factor of 5 in California during COVID. The greater the fraction of people working from home, the greater the reduction will be the workplace visits. And we see this scenario for California, that California experienced higher reduction in workplace visits than the United States. And rural counties experienced less reduction in workplace visits than the urban counties. This is obvious because having the greater opportunity, telecommuting friendly opportunities, the urban counties could substitute more in-person work with work from home than the rural counties. And now we will see exactly what fraction of households in California could replace the in-person work with work from home. And it turns out that 39% of California households could do so. And compared to the other urban states, California and New York had a higher level of substitution. And in rural states, experienced lower fraction of households substituting in-person work with telework than the urban counties. Please note that in this presentation, the word telecommuting, telework, and work from home will be interchangeably used. So now come to the point, which households could substitute more in-person work with work from home? And it turns out that higher income households, white and Asian households, and households consist of 3 to 4 members could substitute more in-person work with work from home. These graphs are shown for the urban states, and similar pattern is observed for rural states. Now I will talk about our second question, that how did activity travel change during COVID? This graph is showing the changes in visits in different activity places in the year 2020 compared to the baseline in California. The baseline value is considered as the 5-week average value from January 3 to February 6, 2020. We have shown changes in visits in 4 activity types. Work is shown as orange color, park as green color, retail and recreation visits cyan color, and grocery and pharmacy visits are shown in blue color. The red shaded area is showing the infection rate over 1 year period, and the amber color is showing the lockdown period, the initial lockdown period. As we can see from this graph, there is sharp decline in all the activity types during the initial lockdown period, followed by an increase in activities, then a stable movement throughout the year. If we compare the changes in activity types, workplace and retail and recreation visits decline more and remain lower throughout the year. In contrast, grocery and park visits increased after the initial lockdown period and approached the baseline. Park visits decreased significantly when the infection rate spiked, particularly during the fall period. Now we will compare the California situation with the other urban states, and a similar pattern is observed for other states. I want to point out that New York experienced a higher surge of park visits during summer compared to the other urban states. And if we look into the rural states, they have experienced less reduction in activities than the urban states. Now, so earlier in the earlier slides, we showed the changes in visits by 4 activity types. This graph is showing changes in trips by 4 trip lengths. It is showing the changes in trips for the year 2020 compared to the same day value of 2019 in California. The blue shaded area is showing the change in fraction of people staying at home. And again, the amber color is showing the initial lockdown period. If we look at the pattern, we can see the similar kind of pattern that we observed for the activity visits. That is initial decline in trips, initial decline in trips in the lockdown period, followed by an increase after the lockdown period, and then stable movement except for the long distance trips. Long distance trips actually increased during summer and fall, due to the vacation type of trips and then decreased after the holidays. If we compare the trips under 25 miles had the greatest reduction. And an interesting pattern we can observe in the last few months that there are increased tendency for all increased type of trip frequency for all type of trip lengths in the last few months. If we compare the California situation with the other states, we can see that California experienced a higher reduction of trips throughout the year in all trip lengths. And rural states, the pattern is a kind of different than the urban states. Okay, so these are the observations on the changes in trips. So far we talked about 2 research questions and I showed the observations on that. I want to mention that these empirical findings are applicable to the first year of the pandemic, and these are aggregated over the 1 year of the pandemic. Now I will talk about the last question. Does work from home impact travel? So for this one, we developed a structural model at the county level, and we conceptualized a causal structure connecting the work from home fraction with work and non-work activity visits, and then connect the non-work and work activity visits with travel. As travel variable, we considered person mile travel, like average distance travel per person per day. And I want to reiterate that for this model, we developed this model using 8-week span of the initial spring outbreak period. We use data from Google Mobility Report and Maryland Transport Institute COVID Impact Analysis Platform report, data. I will not talk much on the model. I just want to mention the major findings that we got from the model output. The counties with greater opportunities to work from home before COVID had greater increases in work from home during COVID. The more people work from home, the greater the reduction in work trips. And the higher the reduction in work trips, the higher the reduction in person mile travel. The reduction in work trips also causes reduction in non-work trips that are associated with the work trips. And finally, a higher work from home proportion corresponds to a reduction in person mile travel. And I want to again mention that these results are only applicable to the initial 2 months of the pandemic, and we have planned to extend our analysis to the subsequent period, and we are expecting changes in the behavior based on the changes in the infection rate and the policy measures. So now the question is, will telecommuting continue? Perhaps it will. Many companies are now currently adopting 3 options for employees: fully remote, flex or hybrid, and traditional in-person. As the flex or hybrid option, they are allowing their employees to be at office for 1 to 3 days for presentations, collaborations, and meetings. And for the rest of the other days, they are allowing them to be at home for work. Other studies also found the potentialities of telecommuting to be continued in the post-pandemic future. So there are some policy issues that we need to think about if telecommuting will continue in the future. So far, we can say that the impact of telecommuting is good for transportation, as we found for the initial lockdown period, like fewer trips, fewer miles travel. So policies that promote telecommuting should be encouraged. However, the impact of telecommuting on business are uncertain. Work productivity for some businesses will be negatively impacted. If fewer workers commute, then it is associated with commuting. For example, the lunchtime business may be negatively affected because there will be fewer people to go out for lunch during office. So telecommuting policies should provide incentives to those businesses to compensate the negative impacts. In addition, the reduction in work trips may negatively impact the public transit ridership, their service. So the public transit authority should need to restructure their service or to provide new technologies to accommodate this kind of changes in working arrangement. And work from home will may change the demand for both commercial and residential space requirements. The employers may need to reduce their commercial space. On the other hand, the residents need to, for employees. And on the other hand, the residents need to enhance their housing to accommodate the dedicated workplace at their home. So there are some issues related to the land use policies, the consequences of telecommuting on local, regional, state land use policies are still uncertain. We have to think about that. And finally, there are some equity issues related to the telecommuting. As we saw, the low-income household couldn't adopt more telecommuting like the high-income household. And if there are less work trips, then the public transit authority may reduce their services in peak hour. That may negatively affect the low-income people who are heavily dependent on that service. So these are the challenges that we need to address to make telecommuting a viable option for future. Thanks to all. Thanks for being here. And thanks for listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know we have some questions starting to roll in, which is fantastic. So please remember to put your questions in the Q&A box. Just a few things, just reminder of that. So we'll now move into our second presentation from Dr. Giovanni Turcella. Dr. Turcella is the Honda Distinguished Scholar for New Mobility Studies and the director of the Three Revolutions Future Mobility Program at UC Davis. Dr. Turcella's interests include travel behavior, emerging mobility services, travel demand modeling, and travel survey methods. His recent research has focused on the impacts of ICT, shared mobility, micromobility, and vehicle automation on travel behavior and auto ownership, the evolving lifestyles and mobility patterns of various population segments, such as millennials, and the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on transportation. Welcome, Dr. Turcella.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for the beautiful introduction. And good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here as part of this webinar. And I will actually dive into my presentation right away. I hope you can see my screen right now. And it's a good segue from what the previous presentation talked about, because our work somehow complements, I think, pretty well what the colleagues at UC Irvine has been doing. So as we clearly know, the pandemic has brought a lot of changes over the past 1.5 years, and a lot of the changes were somehow temporary. And that was the case, for example, for the reduction in car travel. There was a reduction pretty much in the use of all modes during 2020, and there was very, very dramatic for the use of cars, walking, using public transportation, all other share modes, and so on. However, as we're seeing, in the latest stages of the pandemic, things have been changing quite a bit by different transportation modes. And for example, we see now that car travel has considerably rebounded in the United States, in California, and most metro areas. And this is not the case for public transportation, for example. Public transportation ridership remains below the pre-pandemic levels. We also see other changes that are happening. For example, peak travel remains below pre-pandemic levels in most metro areas, but overall VMT, vehicle-miles travel, has somehow bounced back. And so, because passively collected data has always some limitations in what really we can explore in why we see these trends and what is happening, in our group at UC Davis, we've been really engaged in some very detailed research at the disaggregate level, collecting information from thousands of respondents in various regions of the United States and Canada. We targeted in particular 15 regions in the United States and 2 in Canada, Toronto, Vancouver. We have further expanded our focus to make a special effort working with SCAG, the Southern California Association of Governments, to collect more data in the greater Los Angeles region. And somehow, because we were also lucky, let's say, in the research approach, because we could build on previous data collections we carried out in 2018 and 2019, so before the pandemic, in which we collected a lot of data on different aspects of the lifestyle and use of transportation or thousands of respondents, we could build a longitudinal study that is really trying to help us understand the temporary but also longer term impacts of the pandemic. As part of this longitudinal study, we have already conducted 2 rounds of data collection during the pandemic. One was in spring 2020. The second one happened at the end of 2020 in fall 2020, largely in December 2020. And now we are collecting two new big waves of data collection. One is happening right now at the end of spring 2021, and we will have another one about a year from now. So we can really see, also study how the evolution of travel patterns and choices of individuals will evolve as the recovery plays out, more activities are open, and we really also get into the new normal after the pandemic, hopefully is over soon. We have created a website which is available at the address postcovid19mobility.ucdavis.edu, where you can find more information on this research. And I will try to bring some preliminary findings and some summary information in the next few slides. So I will really summarize in this slide some 4 major areas of takeaways on which our research is focusing. The first one we heard already a lot from the previous speaker, telework, remote work. This has been a big pattern during the pandemic. Clearly, there has been a major shift in remote work during the pandemic. This is in particular true among high-income workers and higher education workers. We will get back later in more details about this. But one thing I want to really point is that there is an expectation in the sizable portion of these respondents to continue to work remotely, at least on a part-time basis, more often than they used to do before the pandemic. Another thing that we've been also focusing on a lot is about the use of various modes. The pandemic caused a big reduction in the use of trips, the use of modes for all different trip purposes. And we don't have the data from spring 2021 yet from our surveys, so we really need to use the data from 2020. We could see like a big reduction in all modes, apart from walking for non-commuting travel, but still public transportation is very depressed, but also we could identify a clear mode shift with some respondents that reduce the use of transit, driving more. That is a big issue. It actually has a lot of policy implications. What will happen in the future, and can we recover those travelers to go back to transit? Then also the big revolution has been in the technological field with e-shopping. There's been a huge expansion of e-shopping, also expanding the user base among non-traditional users that were not using e-shopping before. But it's also very different when we look at different services. Delivery apps, so the most modern type of on-demand purchases that we can do with Uber Eats, DoorDash, and so on, these remain more an urban phenomenon, mainly popular among younger dynamic groups. Finally, another area of findings I will want to point to is about changes in car ownership. What we see during the pandemic is that more households have increased the number of vehicles they own versus the number of households that have decreased that number. But in particular, we see increased interest in owning a vehicle among those that were living in zero vehicle households. So at least those that were living in zero vehicle household by choice, not by necessity, because they cannot afford a vehicle, but those that were doing by choice, some of these are getting out of their zero vehicle owning status. This could have huge implications for planning and the future of transportation, because it will affect their future use of vehicles. So let me dive more into some of these findings, and I hope we will have time at the end for question and answers to discuss also policy implications. So first topic I want to touch, we talk a lot about teleworking, but I also want to touch, when we talk about equity and teleworking, first of all, we need to think that equity is also a very big, important topic when we talk about the impacts of the pandemic, because the pandemic has affected different groups in very different ways. So even before we talk about the adoption of teleworking, let's think about financial conditions. And individuals in lower income households are much more likely to report in our survey data that they are financially struggling during the pandemic, and they actually have been having issues in reaching the end of the month. This is coupled with another impact on on the employment sector. Lower income workers are more likely to have been furloughed without pay, to have lost their job, or that their place of employment went out of business. And so somehow the proportion that these things have happened among the lower income classes have been higher than the rest of the population. But now focusing among those that still had a job during the pandemic, of course, there was a massive shift towards teleworking. And our survey data have been also tracking some other things which is very related to this, but very important, I think, because our data showed that there was clear a tendency, in particular, among urban respondents and individuals at the beginning of this, in the early stages of the pandemic, to set up home offices, upgrade hardware and software, improve the Wi-Fi broadband connection at home. So a lot of actions that really improved their ability to work remotely. This could actually be a proxy for being more able to telecommute and work remotely more easily, also in the future. So something very important to consider. Also, during the pandemic, remote work was more easily accepted by both employers and employees, that allowed this big shift also in the average amount of teleworking people engaged. So in the bottom of those figures, you can see this, this graph here, the Sankey diagram here, showing the change in the number of days that the same respondents were telework in fall 2019, in spring 2020, and in fall 2020. And we can clearly see a big increase in the average number of days individuals were teleworking during the early stages of the pandemic in particular. Now, if we try to decouple this by different groups, the patterns are very different. We will look at lower income workers versus higher income workers. So for example, we see that our data are clearly showing that lower income workers were more likely to be considered essential workers, and if they have retained their job, to have to physically commute even during the COVID-19 pandemic. Among the higher income, higher educated white collar workers, there was a much higher ability to work remotely. We didn't find big differences in terms of age, gender distribution. So this was more like, kind of a socioeconomic status and type of job that the individual have, more than an age or gender distribution. So somehow historically there are differences by age, but I say the pandemic was leveling them up also because of the increased health concerns among older individuals. Now, one thing that is very important to consider moving forward, a sizable portion of our respondents report that they have an expectation to continue to work remotely also after the pandemic is over, at least on a part-time basis. So somehow at a higher degree than what they were doing before the pandemic. And this could have huge impacts, in particular on travel during the peak time, AM and PM peak time. Now let's look more about the use of various modes of transportation. So I'm using here data only from 2020, so we don't really have the data yet with the recovery in driving and other trips during 2021. But during 2020, we could see a reduction in trips for all purposes by all different modes of transportation, with the exception of an increase in walking from non-work and non-commuting trips. Also, we can see some other interesting things, and one that I want to mention is not reported here in the graphs, is that ride-hailing, so the use of Uber and Lyft, dropped dramatically during the pandemic. However, this was mainly for leisure trips and discretionary trips. In particular, among low-income groups, we found that the reduction was not that big, and many of these users were keeping using ride-hailing to access healthcare facilities, access basic services. This is something very important to consider, also considering the role that new mobility is having to really provide mobility for those that don't have other options. Another topic that is on the right of this slide I want to point to is the substantial mode shift we have recorded during 2020. Among individuals that have reduced the use of public transportation during 2020, we can find that more than 1/3 of them, or about 1/3, have actually been driving more. So this is a typical clear mode shift that was recorded during that time. We are still investigating more the trip purposes. This might be related also to those that were working from home, and so they don't use public transportation to go to their work or place of employment during the morning, but then when they are at home, they might use their car more often to go to the grocery shopping, to the gym, and so on. And we have this data, we're analyzing them more. But it's something actually very important also for policy implications. I touched already a little bit on the topics about online shopping. We call this a little bit of a democratization of e-shopping. The user base has expanded beyond the traditional user base of online shoppers. So now we have more people that are also elderly, non-urban population, and started to shop online. But still we see that low-income households in particular are lagging behind. Also during the pandemic, this was affecting somehow, of course, trips that were made for shopping purposes, with a large reduction of shopping trips, but also huge impacts with an increase in goods delivery trips. And so this somehow has accelerated a trend that was pre-existing before the pandemic. We wonder how much of this will remain also in the future. The food delivery apps was a little bit different situation. This is our survey data showed that this phenomenon is still mainly an urban phenomenon, and the adopters are mainly urban, younger, dynamic segments of the population, but also that it was strongly correlated with the reduction in trips to restaurants. So somehow we think that it could be at least a partial reversal of this trend, as many of these users return to restaurants and might need to use food delivery apps less. The last topic I want to touch is the topic of vehicle ownership. A very important topic, as I mentioned before, households have increased the number of vehicles more often than decreasing it. And we see actually that a sizable portion of respondents report an interest in increasing vehicle ownership, and this is in particular true among those that live in zero vehicle households. So this might have an impact in particular because we see that the interest in living a car light and multimodal lifestyle is sensibly lower now than it used to be in 2018, 2019. So if this trend continues, it will have an impact on future transportation. But also we know that those individuals that have gone out of the zero vehicle household status, now they have a car in their garage, and this might affect their likelihood, at least in this group, to travel potentially more by car in the medium term. We don't see big changes in the fundamentals behind the adoption of alternative fuel vehicles, pretty much unchanged situation. We keep seeing that better educated urban population groups tend to be more interested in them, and this is true for also during the pandemic. So somehow the distribution, at least by fuel type, doesn't really seem to change that much. So I will really wrap up on my presentation touching a couple of topics which is related to the equity issues. I think I mentioned already several of them, but I also want to focus on traffic congestion and potential environmental impacts. We see that there is a potential for discretionary trips to offset, at least in part, the reduced volume of commute trips. But this might be associated also with some of the mode shift that is happening between modes. Plus, we see more car dependence happening because also the higher vehicle ownership that seems to be happening. And we see also some substitution, not only between public transportation and cars, but also about another thing that I have not mentioned so far, but we're doing analysis on long distance travel. And we see a pretty substantial number of airplane trips that in the past were done by plane, that now is being happened by car. This is true in particular for medium distances that can be covered by car relatively comfortably. And so this trend, if it continues in the future, is something very important for policy, planning, and environmental implications. So moving forward, we'll need to consider what the supply also will be, because we focus a lot on demand, but the supply is changing. We see mergers and acquisitions with companies changing their business models, merging activities, reducing the supply. We see also changes in cities with more space dedicated to pedestrians, more space for bicyclists. Some of these were only tactical urbanism measures, so done on the short term, but are becoming in some cases also longer term changes. This could affect demand. And so the big question with which I want to really close is, many people ask me, are we going back to the past, to the pre-pandemic, to our previous life? And the literature has been showing that usually after a large disruption, individuals tend to go back to their previous behaviors and habits. But however, this disruption has been very long, and the longer the disruption, the higher likelihood we might have more longer term changes. Among these, we are also seeing that e-shopping is probably here to stay. Retail space will be changed most likely forever. Economic activities will need time to recover. Travelers still seem hesitant to use shared travel modes, but also the potential limited persistence of part-time work really will affect potentially the use of certain modes and the volumes of travel, in particular during peak time. We see that in particular, rail ridership these days is below the pre-pandemic levels in those places where a lot of rail riders can substitute easily with telecommuting. So somehow these balances is something to consider very well, and a big role will be associated, of course, with policies which are developed, in particular to try to support active travel and avoid a resurgence of car travel. So we will try to understand many of these aspects in the future. We have a new data collection happening now, also with a stratified random sampling of California households. We're doing also printed questionnaire to reduce the potential bias with online surveys. Many times we have online surveys during the pandemic, but this is inevitably having some sampling biases, while also having priority areas with more minorities and low-income communities. Doing more surveys in both English and Spanish, we're using ways to correct for non-representativeness and deviation from the characteristics of the population. But also we have identified priority themes to work with councils, the California Resources Board, all our other partners to identify really changes in travel behavior choices, sustainability impacts on greenhouse gas emissions, vehicle-less travel, and so on. Equity issues, very important. telecommuting and the potential impacts on travel patterns in the future, adoption in shopping, new mobility, but also changes in residential location and household choice changes, which is not something we really discuss in this presentation, but I will be happy to touch perhaps in the question and answer. With this, I will acknowledge our wonderful research team at UC Davis and partner institutions, and also our great supporting agencies that are making this research possible. And I'm available for questions and answers. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I know we're starting to get some Q&A coming in, so Giovanni, please feel free to answer them. But we will now move into a really great opportunity before Q&A to hear from a guest respondent on the reactions to the presentations, including how the research could be applied to California policy. Today, we are very lucky to have Ellen Greenberg, who is the Deputy Director for Sustainability at the California Department of Transportation, also known as Caltrans. Ellen's team at Caltrans is leading culture change in the department with new initiatives to move the state away from auto dependency, promote zero-emission vehicles, prepare for the impacts of climate change, and integrate equity considerations into the department's work. Ellen has over 30 years of experience working with cities, transportation agencies, and non-governmental organizations to guide transportation development and conservation decisions. She holds degrees in geography, city and regional planning, and transportation engineering from UC Berkeley, and she's a fellow of the American Institute of Certified Planners. Welcome, Ellen.
Thanks so much, Stephen. I'm glad to be here, and I really appreciated the presentations. This is a topic that I have really found fascinating, and I'm going to maybe, perhaps a little provocatively, shine a light on a different aspect of the questions. So I think of the last 14 months from a transportation perspective as an unwelcome natural experiment, right? We got to see behaviors that we would never otherwise have gotten to see. And at the same time as we appreciate the learning opportunity, we hope this set of conditions will never be repeated. So all of these transportation behaviors and phenomena that we're talking about were within the context, right, of this very unique period. So I think that for practitioners and particularly agency folks who are thinking about services and facilities to be provided going forward, there's a fundamental question about what is the relevance of this experience, right? Which parts of this experience might stick, could stick in a beneficial way, and what can we learn, given how unique this time has been. And when we started to see that recovery in total vehicle miles traveled that happened pretty early in the in the period after that initial 2 months of very severely restricted activity, I immediately started wondering, what are these trips and how do we align our view of rising VMT with continued economic closure and economic hardship? Dr. Cicella's research is showing, over about 45% of the people that responded to his survey reported economic hardship. Typically we think of that as associated with less driving. So this trend that we've seen, the recovery in VMT, to me is really fascinating in light of the extent of shutdown, the disruption to education at all levels, the disruption to children's activities, when we know that school and children's activities have a very substantial impact on household travel patterns. All of these changes happening within this within this frame of the emergency. At the same time, Caltrans as an organization, like many of your organizations, responded as an employer, as well as a service provider and as owner operator of the state system, to understand how we could better respond to the needs in the emergency and also how we could support our workforce. So this is where we start to see some changes that really do stick in the area of investments that have been made by many organizations to enable that remote working. So my organization, for example, purchased 10,000 laptops during the pandemic, enabling people to work remotely that previously simply didn't have the equipment to do so. So we have this whole raft of changes. But I do want to highlight the fact that I think it's really worth considering, what the relevance is going forward, how we may know, how would we know when we've achieved some kind of post-pandemic equilibrium and we're seeing changes that reflect a post-pandemic state as opposed to another recovery stage. And I'll just conclude by saying that I think, the biggest takeaway that we have seen is that the state and nation are highly auto-dependent. And that even when we have a high level of economic shutdown, when we have a high level of work from home, we continue to have a very high level of driving. The loss of transit ridership is obviously part of that, particularly in the most urbanized areas of the state. And I think we've probably tended to undervalue the impact of transit on suppressing driving during the day, because folks who have a transit commute are not with their car during the day, so they can't drive. And also often they are in places where they can accomplish their daily business, on foot or through additional transit use. So, when I think about households where folks are working at home, whether hopefully when schools are open, when the economy is open again, I think our work should be continuing to focus on enabling at the neighborhood scale folks to walk, cycle, use local transit to access the places they need to go, the schools, the parks, the shops, the friends, and the access to mainline transit that will connect them to regional destinations. So that challenge seems to still be with us. And I think that nothing we've learned from the pandemic period changes that. But still, lots more to think and talk about. So I'll look forward to hearing some of the Q&A and taking part. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellen. And yes, we'll head into a series on Q&A. I first want to kind of ask a little bit, kind of going off of what you said, Ellen, is discussing what this all means for public transit agencies. I think that's something that has been reflective and a thread that is, tied through all the presentations as well as your responses. And so I just would like the panel to just comment on how they view public transit agencies and the impact that telecommuting will have and what needs to be changed. And I know you're not public transit necessarily experts, but I think it's really important to start connecting that thread. So if you could talk a little bit more, everyone on the panel, about what an agency could do now in order to really take advantage of the shifting, but also ensure that there's still equitable transportation being provided.
Should I take it first?
Go ahead.
Okay. I hope people can hear me. Everybody can hear me well. I received a message during the presentation saying that my microphone probably was not working super well. So I hope you can hear me well now. I think it's a very, very important question. And it's also not just one answer, because as always, one size doesn't fit all. So first of all, public transportation is very, very diverse. And so we go from local bus services that are used by certain type of users to all the way to subway system of commuter rail or other services that are used by very different demographics. Certainly, I would say that there is things could go either way. There is a potential for transit ridership to continue to suffer for many reasons that we said. First of all, let's look at services like Caltrain or the Capitol Corridor in Northern California. In a lot of cases, their ridership includes a lot of individuals that want to make use of their time while traveling. So they, for example, use the Wi-Fi and they use their computer, and in many cases are office workers or service industry, high-tech workers, government employees, which are really the categories that right now in many cases are working remotely still full-time, 5 days a week, or they might enjoy some flexibility in the future. If I am a factory worker, most likely I cannot work. But if I am a government employee, I could have some flexible policy to work 1 or 2 days a week. same for academic individuals and so on. So certainly there is the potential for potential competition between these. And it is also a reason for which we see that the recovery in some bus services is actually happening faster than many rail services around the country, also because of the different demographics. APTA data from the American Plane Transportation Association is also showing that public transportation ridership right now tends to be more diverse, less white, more minorities, more people of colors, more lower income individuals, also because the teleworkers have disappeared from public transportation. So moving forward, of course, we can move into the space of commuting benefits. I mean, there's a lot of space to do. Public transportation is a tiny percent of total trips in California and the US. And the big issue that we have is that too many people drive. And so we need to address this. So somehow the pandemic will move this balance, but also the future is really will be shaped. And with commuter benefits, with potential to discourage driving, with potential also to change our cities to make more encouragement to walk and bike and use public transportation. We saw some wonderful examples of cities promoting a more pedestrian-friendly and bicycling-friendly environment and so on. Still, in too many places, individuals are concerned about using public transportation. It's dirty sometimes. They are concerned about safety and security. They are concerned about other things. But cities have been making a push to make somehow our streets not only a place for cars, but for all other users. That is something we need to capitalize on. I don't expect the US to suddenly become the Netherlands tomorrow, but I think there is potential for change. I will pause here because I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
Ellen or Rizwana?
Professor McNally, can you please add something first, then maybe?
Yeah, I was going to make a general comment, and I agree with most of Giovanni's comments. And then it's an analogy, and I wish I had a graphic for this, that involves the impact of technologies. And I know COVID's not a technology, but it's something with a big impact. So a typical plot of a technology trend will be a lot of hype. Everyone kind of buys into it, whether you're actually buying the technology or promoting the technology. I mean, there were people years ago that were saying, you know, all cars are going to be autonomous by right now. I got news, there's none of them are, okay? The bottom line with technology, you overhype, and then there's an overreaction the opposite way. And you get this trend that might approach some sort of mean, but it takes time to establish that. Now, with the pandemic, you had this, you know, huge increase, and I'll just focus on telecommuting. And it's still there, but it's declining. As more people kind of go back to normal, we're getting fewer people that are telecommuting. The figures that we had, I think, nationwide, and Rizwana, correct me if I'm wrong, we mentioned 35%. It's below 30% now, but I'm not sure what the exact number is. And as that occurs, of course, more people are driving, maybe using public transit, but we don't know if that's approaching the old level of telecommuting. Will it go below the old level? Will it stabilize somewhere higher? It's just something we don't know yet. So my recommendation to Caltrans is that we don't be too quick with our recommendations and assessments of trends, but we monitor, and that may involve looking at all these various data sets and maybe having, you know, more webinars like this and more comments from people. There was a lot of good questions about impacts on public transit and the like. Some of those good questions couldn't be answered by the data that we have, but might be if we do a little more surveying of along the lines of what Giovanni's doing, and also of businesses. What are businesses planning on doing? The best we could find is a quote on this area or this professional group, but let's do a survey of business. How many are actually planning on returning to an office? How many still have an office to return to? I think those are the questions that maybe, I don't want to pick on Caltrans, but Caltrans or ARB and other state agencies might want to start looking at. Our general assessment from our data is that whatever the problems are in California, that we're doing a pretty darn good job of keeping on top of them compared to a lot of other states.
Right. I think that the challenge of collecting the data we need is one on which we're going to be collaborating with the academic partners. And, you know, I'll point in particular to the question about telecommute. So some of you may have looked at the Census Household Pulse data, which initially, very early in pandemic, the census started conducting a weekly survey, and it asked, I believe, whether there were members of the household who were substituting some remote work for their prior, work at their work site. So that's a really interesting data point, but it's also very limiting as we're trying to understand more deeply what the travel demand changes are going to be. So when we have data that's at the household level, we need to, complement that with data that helps us understand household composition, but having data, at the level of the individual or the workplace would help us even more. And my view is that the likelihood is that we are going to see a retention of a certain level of telework, and that 2 or 3 days in the office and 2 or 3 days working remotely is going to become a very, very common pattern. Still, that's going to apply only for the portion of the workforce that is in jobs that can be performed remotely. So we're still, from a travel point of view, we're talking about just the share of work of trips that are commute trips, and just the share of commute trips, that are, shall I say, convertible to remote work. And those are frequently the same trips that were during the peak hour and that we're using the most congested facilities, because our office employment centers are generally the densest employment centers. And not coincidentally, those are also the locations that are most effectively served by transit. So, it's a pretty big tangle of issues there, and continued data gathering on these points will really be helpful.
Wonderful, thank you. Another thing that has come up, at least in the Q&A, and then I also had written down, is talking about implementation. So we've talked a lot about the trends. We've talked about how the implications we have on, for example, GHG emissions, even equity, even long-term resilience of our transportation system. But I think a really important question that a lot of folks on the call have is, what can we do now? And what is an implementable short or long-term policy? This is just kind of a general question for everyone. You can go ahead and answer it based on your experience. It can be state level or all the way down to local, but something that can be short-term and something that can be long-term, that can be done now to start guiding transportation and achieving our critical goals.
So I'll just jump in on a short-term practice that emerged, I think, was already in use, but really came to the fore during pandemic, which is quick build and temporary reallocation of street space to provide more space for pedestrians, cyclists, and recreational use of the public right-of-way. So that's happened, with the institution of slow streets in many cities. And at the state level, that also prompted the department to consider whether we could also make such accommodations on state highways that function as city streets or town main streets. And there has been some ability, I think, to do that in fairly short order. Something else that probably hasn't come to the attention of most of the folks on the webinar is that there were a lot of issues associated with freight movement during pandemic. And one of the issues is that the locations where trucks would typically stop and truck drivers would get food, have meals, etc., a lot of those were closed or limited. So we enabled the locating of food trucks in our safety and roadside rest areas, which were not previously allowed. So that was an emergency response, to the immediate need. So, there are a variety of quick responses. I know a number of the transit agencies are considering free fares or reduced fares or various kinds of incentives to get folks back on transit, or get folks to try transit that haven't ever tried before. So we're seeing some of those, quicker moves, as well as the longer term ones.
Great, thank you. Giovanni?
I don't know how much time we have.
Go ahead.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So I totally agree with everything Ellen mentioned about, the support for various type of policies that can be low-hanging fruits. In particular, I think the land use, the urban street design, the facilities to promote active travel, I think, are very important. A quick question also will need to be posed to how to reorganize services. For example, the pandemic might have accelerated some trends, not only in shopping, but even, for example, for the transition to on-demand services. So should we really embed also the way public transportation work? We know that public transportation, the fixed guideline works well on certain corridors for commuting trips, for example, but it's not very often used for discretionary travel, but it's more flexible forms of integration with on-demand services, whether it's like flexible routing or on-demand services, first last mile access, fare integration with other services. Can we move the type of services to a way to accommodate under the new normal after the pandemic? But I think the big question also is, at this point, is everything we knew from before the pandemic, do we need to reassess it and it's different now, or will be the same? Because there were a lot of processes that were going. New York, Los Angeles, and California have been planning for road pricing. Should the road pricing be deployed still in the same way we planned it and we thought about it before the pandemic, or the situation is different because cities are different, trips are different, behaviors are different? And so should we customize it? Should we rethink the way we plan for investments in road infrastructure, for public transportation, for other things? And so what portion of the lessons learned from the past still apply today? Probably many of them, but also how we need to update these things, because now things are changing. And this might mean also that the willingness to pay might be different, the needs of the customers may be different, and even the same type of subscription model for flat fares or monthly fares, for example, might be different now. If, for example, individuals don't take transit 20 days a month to go to work, but they take it only 15. So should we reevaluate monthly passes? Should we reevaluate the type of fare system we use? And so all these things, I think, is very important that we try to assess that.
I wonder if I could add something, Stephen.
Of course.
I'm not a fan for a variety of reasons of road pricing in general and VMT taxes, and that's another webinar. But that is a way that you could affect something that could have an immediate impact, or at least a short-term impact, implementable in a short term, and that is taking care of the peak hours. That's been the biggest impact, I think, of the pandemic. It's not the overall VMT decrease, which right now is not very big, but I just a couple of days ago drove to LAX and I got 45 miles away and back, and I did it in an hour and a half. You can do the math, and that's including dropping someone off. There was no traffic, and the bottom line is that if we could somehow flatten that peak by providing incentives, and one of those incentives to business could be counterbalanced by pricing people out of the peak. And now there's equity issues with that, just like there's with any type of pricing. But the bottom line is that if you could spread out that peak, you might be able to address some of the worst impacts. And by the way, it's not just on auto traffic. It's also on the costs associated with transit. Flattening the transit peak can make transit operations much more effective. So those are my suggestions.
Thank you for bringing that up. I was going to mention the flattening of public transit as well can actually perhaps increase service at other hours that are necessary for commuters that are not necessarily working a 9-to-5 job and need, for example, late night service, and being able to reallocate those services and that funding elsewhere. Rizwana, anything you want to add?
I want to add that there may be some changes in the land use policies. There may need to do that. So we have to think on that, because the employers can reduce their commercial spaces because they have been cut down in the employees, or like if anyone wants to work at home, they might increase their like housing or workspace at home. So there are some issues related to these check and balance. So we have to think on the land use policies aspect, and for the public transit, I want to mention that if there are less work trips, so there'll be cut down in the public transit services. So they have to restructure that services to accommodate that demand. I don't know how they can do that or what might be the appropriate policies to do that, but we need to think more on these issues because public transit heavily depended on the commute trips. So yeah, these are the points that I want to reiterate. Yeah.
Anyone else have any other final thoughts on this specific implementable topic? Actually, Ellen, I do want to come back to you briefly. There was a question that came up about CEQA exemptions, perhaps requiring legislation. As came in, what can Caltrans do to make open streets and streets easier to implement on a permanent basis? You have an answer to
that? Sure. So first, in terms of the department's direct authority, that's relevant to state highways only or facilities that are intersecting with state highways. But on local streets and roads, Caltrans still has a really big impact because many local governments use our design standards. So we're actually having discussions currently ongoing about whether we can create some kind of guidance around quick builds, especially that will be helpful to local governments. But I would say that everyone who's in a position as either as an active member of the public or a staff member at a city or county agency, in adopting the state guidance for design, there really needs to be some very careful evaluation of the relevance of, some of those standards to conditions locally. But that connection is maintained. So I do think some of the changes we're making to move towards more flexible allocation of the right of way will support that local desire.
Fantastic. So I do have one last question before I wrap up for all the panelists, and that has to do with, we've talked a lot about strategies and policies today, but there is a concern, my own as well as many in the Q&A session, about the equity implications. And I want you to identify one of the policies or strategies that you have identified today. It can be any of them. And I want you to just provide perhaps a reframing of that policy and strategy in a way that ensures equity. And it doesn't, you can choose the specific group or population in which it ensures equity. But I just want to make sure that this is an important part of this webinar and bring that up as a last question. So Ellen, if you'd like to go first, or one of the other presenters as well.
Sure. Well, I'll come back to the issue actually of our workforce because it's an example and it's also relevant for other organizations. So we have people in a really wide variety of job classifications, and many of them really needed to have that assigned laptop from Caltrans in order to be able to work remotely. So making that purchase and distributing the laptops was key towards enabling those folks who have work that can be done remotely to enabling them to work remotely and get the safety benefits associated with that. But at the same time, the issue for our people and for folks all over the state of broadband access is a really central issue, and obviously for remote schooling as well as for remote working, and so many people who are dealing with both simultaneously. So we do have a role in the installation and maintenance of broadband infrastructure because of the use of the state right-of-way for laying the physical cable for broadband. And so that whole program is, I think, scaling up. I think there's been a huge amount of focus. There's also been some innovative work from transit agencies. I know that SAC-RT located some of their buses in neighborhoods when they had service cuts during COVID, so that those buses could be wireless hotspots. So there's been some, really, I think, great responses. But longer term, this is something that Caltrans is very involved in, and I know is being addressed in the state budget proposals as well.
Wonderful, thank you. Mike, Giovanni, Rizwana?
I'll take a quick crack at an issue that kind of on two different broad concerns that Rizwana raised. One dealing with land use and then indirectly with public transit. My prior comments in terms of the peak problem, which affects obviously both highways and transit, And actually, Stephen, you made the comment afterwards, when you flatten that peak, if you could actually reallocate resources to other periods, you're improving transit for the other periods. And a system like public transit, and I am not an expert at public transit, but it seems to me a more equal provision of services by time of day and by geographic reach makes a lot more sense on all levels. So that would be an advantage and an equity issue to move toward. The other issue is something I'm kind of really reaching for, and that's that pejorative term sprawl. But it might be that if people really do continue at the current rates to telecommute, then living far off somewhere is not necessarily a bad thing. There's lots of other impacts, I know that, but not necessarily a bad thing from the perspective of a commute. And that includes people that have to move out to avoid cost of living in that may not have to commute now, may not have the negative impact of coming back. So these are very long-term things, and I really can't put my finger on which way it's going to go, but it's something to keep our eye on. The land use issue and sprawl may not be as bad as it is relative to the commute. I'm not talking about a lot of other issues associated with sprawl.
Yeah. Giovanni?
Sure. Great points raised by both Ellen and Mike. I really think one of the major issues in equity is, in California in particular, is housing affordability. And that is a huge problem that we have. And so, we'll touch the topic of equity for access to transportation, public transportation, and so on. But housing affordability is a huge issue. And it's actually something that already today makes a lot of people live in very, very bad conditions, really because also the imbalance between the distribution of jobs and housing. And I personally don't think that sprawling will solve the problem that much, because if there are people, my apologies, Mike, for not agreeing with your view of sprawling, but I think if there are some people that might benefit from sprawling, certainly not the lower income workers, but in many cases it will be like people like me or some other well-educated individuals that can work remotely, while a lot of jobs that are minimum wage jobs and they cannot telecommute, and so they will not really benefit it so much. Neither I believe in a future where congestion will go away simply because we have a little bit more telecommuting. Congestion will be here to stay, and people that are traveling long distances, they live in the Central Valley and they work in San Francisco, they will not magically get teletransported there in 15 minutes. So it is a very, very big toll that they pay. But at the same time, I think that the pandemic potentially, if there is one impact that it is giving us, it's allowing us to buy some time. So let's assume, for example, that there is a little bit of a part-time telecommuting remain for some time. DNT might be back because of more discretionary travel, other travel, and so on. But the peak time will be a little bit more reduced. We can use the infrastructure a little bit more efficiently in the meantime. That might give us a couple of extra years before, like, the crazy levels of congestion during the peak time will come back. Let's act in the meantime. Let's use those years to really do solid policy, good investments to solve the problem for the long term. It's not that congestion will go away from California, assuming that the economy will continue to grow and California will be still a desirable place where to live. We'll still have the pressure, the demographic pressure and the job pressure, and we don't really have land to everybody being accommodated everywhere where they want to be, unless we make some infrastructure changes, some land use changes in the meantime, and also financial changes. As the economy rebounds, this might give us more financial leverage that can be used actually to alleviate social issues and equity issues. And so it's really up to us to grab that opportunity.
Great, thank you, Giovanni. Rizwan, do you have any last very quick comments before we have to head out?
For the future pandemic, we have to think about some equitable approach so that those who cannot adopt the telecommuting practice due to their nature of jobs can get an easy access to the job facilities, healthcare facilities, or the transportation facilities they relied on. And if we think about the VMT taxes, that might affect the low-income people because they have to travel to the workplace. So they cannot do their work at home. So we need to think about these equity issues before implementing these policies.
Great, thank you, Rizwana. And thank you so much to all the panelists. We are out of time, unfortunately, but that was a fantastic conversation. So just a few things that I want to mention before everyone goes. If you would like to contact the presenters and the respondents, we recommend you reach out to them directly. I think their emails should hopefully be in the chat. We have a few more quick announcements. First, there'll be a webinar featuring UCITS funded research on the policy scenarios of achieving carbon neutrality in transportation by 2045 in California on June 23rd. And that actually kicks off a larger series on that report on carbon neutrality. And that's going to be a several webinar series in a row. Information for registering for the webinar is in the chat. Second, this webinar qualifies for 1 AICP CM credit or 1 professional development hour credit. Information for obtaining the credit is located in the Zoom registration confirmation email. If you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to me at stephen.wong@berkeley.edu. Thank you again to all the panelists. Have a wonderful day, and we hope you stay safe during this time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Stephen.